Thank you, everyone, for staying here and listening to our project results, and especially now to the country comparative analysis. And as you can imagine, and you already got some glimpses of it, the situation is very different in all the 4 countries, and this was really a very exciting part of it. So what will I show you? First, I want to make some conceptual clarifications about assessment and grading. Then one of the most important features to understand the reactions of and the usage of practices, of specific practices in the school systems, is to understand what role selection and inclusion plays in the school systems, because it's very different. So we came up then to think about assessment regimes and school cultures in the countries to better understand practices. And of course, as it is cultural responsive assessment, we wanted to understand the answers, the practices, with respect to the concept of culture and what is called the dialectics of difference. And in the end, a short glimpse to the practices, which you already heard several of them in the presentations. So grading and assessment regimes, you heard more now about formative assessment, but we found out to understand why in some countries teachers have much more difficulties maybe to think about cultural responsive assessment, is that grading is the focus of their assessment practices. So we want to distinguish these 2 concepts. Assessment is the procedure whereby learning outcomes are made visible, and grading is the value judgment attached to specific learning outcomes. So when we think about the role of grading in these school systems, we used this model of 6 different functions of grading. The first most obvious function is the evaluation of outcomes. Grades are often used in the classroom context to not only regulate performance, but also behavior, to discipline students, also to the extent to stigmatize them with negative grades. Grades are used as incentives and motivations by the teachers. And very importantly, for some school systems, they are a tool of selection at the end of the school year to allow moving up to the next level or not. Or to, at the end of institutional cycles, to allocate to specific tracks, to specific ability tracks, specific school types, and last but not least, at the end of the school career, grades are taken as a prediction of future performance. So grades have, in some of the systems, a very big role and a very impact on the teachers and how they think about their teaching and, of course, about their assessment. So we have, for the grading, different reference systems. One is, of course, the curricular norm, that is the criteria, the goals you wanted to reach with your instruction in math or in science, languages. And this grading takes place irrespective of prior knowledge and irrespective of classroom context. It's the criteria or curricular norm when it's applied. The second one and most important one, for example, as we can see in the Austrian system, is the social norm. That is, the teacher orients her grading to the average level of the class performance. So this is not very surprising. But what is surprising when we look at the statistics, that of course the result of the grading along social norm is that a specific grade can mean totally different things, of course. when you look at the graphics, it's just mind-blowing. So the grading that is taking place in the classroom is the grading along a norm distribution. So, in primary class, it's not the norm distribution, but it's with the good marks, the highest frequency, and almost no negative marks, very few. And the last one, the individual norm, relates to the student performance, relates the student performance to prior level of competence. And the teacher, in this case, thinks most about the individual progress, the individual effort, and this is, of course, the norm which plays the biggest role in cultural responsive assessment, because you are thinking about the individual student and her effort and progress. So this is one side which is very important to understand the differences between the countries. And then we have to know how selection and grading really works in the school systems. When you think about selection processes, you have horizontal selections. This is within the same grade level as, for example, tracking in different school forms, the special school, the academic track, the regular non-academic oriented track, or within a school also you can have sorting into ability groups. So mathematics, for example, we had in Austria 20 years ago, like 3 ability groups and with different teachers in different classrooms. And vertical selection means that students are not allowed, when getting a negative mark, to move up to the next level, so they have to repeat class, or they're not allowed to start schooling. They have to do a preschool year before they are allowed to start schooling. Why is this so important in this context? Because, for example, for Austria, the percentages of students who have to are target of these selection processes are much higher within the migrant population. So when you look at the statistics, you see it's 2 times, 3 times as many students with migration background who have to repeat classes, who are asked to do a preschool year, who are attending regular school, the non-academic school form, or who are sent to special schools. This is not entirely true for the whole student population with migration background, but it is specifically true for specific heritage countries or countries of origin. And this is not because these countries have a very specific characteristics, but because parents from these countries didn't have much school experience themselves. They, for various reasons, they maybe only attended primary school or lower secondary school, and this in some school system has a big impact on the school success of their children. So when we look at lower secondary, we also see that these are different age groups, different grade levels in the different school systems. And this is also interesting because you understand that primary school, the phase where there is it's compulsory and there is not much selection going on, is very short in some countries. Like in Austria, it's only the first 4 years of schooling. And then already with age 9, there is a big selection process with the tracking. And in Ireland, until end of lower secondary school, basically there is no big selection process going on. So the teachers in Ireland, they're not very obsessed with grading and value judgments to the performance and the learning outcomes of the students, which makes a whole lot of difference when you think about culturally responsive assessment and applying only the individual norm, which is the most important and most interesting thing for the student also when he or she develops. Whereas teachers in systems where you have to perform all the time selection, the individual norm is a big problem. How to deal with this? So this grading as a selection procedure takes place at different times in the school career, in different frequency, therefore has a different importance in different countries. We have to understand the teacher's approach to culturally responsive assessment from this perspective. Those teachers, they experience big pressure, not only because they have a high responsibility towards the student when deciding, well, he's not allowed to move up, she should go to special school, or she should go to non-academic track, but also because parents exert pressure, and of course there's also some monitoring going on. And interestingly enough, in these school systems, assessment is much more a lonely, if not isolated, practice, for the teachers. And it's quite interesting when you think about it, because it's the context where you have the highest responsibility. And it's the context where the teacher do it basically alone, are not used to exchange about it. I mean, they exchange about what was the outcome, but not about the process, really, but the contents. And so it puts the teachers in a very specific place. What we found in the schools when we interviewed teachers and the school leader, also parents and students, that very seldomly there is an assessment culture in a school, so that the principal would say, okay, in our school we all have the same strategy in assessment. But what we found in most places is that there are some very engaged teachers. They try new things and they are enthusiastic about those new things. Oftentimes these new things are not as have not as much weight as the traditional things, because they have to rely on their traditional practices, but they are enthusiastic and try things. At the same time, you have teachers who are oftentimes then the older age group in the teaching force, who, they exercise what they have been doing in assessment for the last 20 years or 30 years. So very rarely we find a real coherent assessment culture in a school. For the tension between the criteria, social and individual norm of grading, of course, this is hard for the teachers to manage. Therefore, we have to see national standardized testing in a new light. For me, this was one of the most interesting learning experiences of this project, that I understood when you have a system like in Ireland, where the whole weight, so to say, of selection and value judgment is on the national standardized test, teachers are relieved to a great extent by this heavy weight of having to, think all the time about selecting themselves, selecting out and grading. Before, of course, national standardized assessment, we don't have. In some countries, we have it as a monitoring instrument, but we don't have it as a selection tool or as a high-stakes testing. For example, in Austria, students would not care about their outcomes because it has no consequences for them. And even individual teachers, it doesn't have a real big consequence. The ministry even wanted to not that the data is not shown to the public and parents and so on. They just wanted to have a monitoring tool. So we have in grade 4 and grade 8 national standardized testing, but it's for to know how the schools are doing and where to improve as a policy decision, for the policy decisions. So it's totally different. When you read, for example, in this and that countries, they have national standardized testing. It doesn't mean anything in the sense that you know what kind of consequences it has, because it can have totally different consequences. In some countries, it has consequences for the teacher, very high stakes consequences for the teacher, but not for the students. So this is very different in the different countries. And so we have to understand what that means for the teachers' practices. We heard already some things about formative and summative assessment. We didn't see much of the formative assessment, for example, in Austria, much more in Norway and in Ireland. And Turkey, I guess, is in the middle with a strong emphasis also on the national standardized test in the higher grades. We tried to develop a comparative framework for these assessment regimes, and we're thinking about the most important dimensions, like how much are standardized assessment practices used and non-standardized, what importance does the classroom-based assessment play and the standardized by national agencies developed assessment play, how much is formative assessment used and summative assessment, and how much are innovative techniques and traditional methods in use in classroom assessment. So you can see that oftentimes Austria and Turkey are more similar, and Ireland and Norway, although it's not all the way through the same kind of combination, which makes it even more interesting and more complex, of course. Well, when we talk about countries, this is always speaking about a very rough characteristicum, because of course there are inconsistencies, there are different periods, like for example in Austria we had like 10 years where there was much emphasis on new innovative techniques and formative assessment should be introduced. At the moment, that is the last 2 years, we had a complete rollback. So when we talk about assessment regimes before 2017 and after 2017 in Austria, it's a big difference. So it's hard to talk about countries. Norway is like this, Austria is like this, Ireland is like this, because oftentimes you have policy changes, but of course you also have inconsistencies within the teaching force. There may be different sections, maybe primary school teachers have a different approach, like in Austria. They are usually much more open towards formative assessment. They tried to follow, to abolish the grading as much as possible. Whereas in the secondary level, the sorting and selection is much deeper in the mind of the teachers and is much harder to abolish. So to come to the cultural aspect, it is very important that teachers, of course, try to understand what in behavior and in assessment procedures and results of the students could be accorded to culture, the background of the students, the cultural background. And of course, we have to consider that there are many factors. As one colleague said, the gender factor, of course, plays a big role. The social milieu, the social class, of course, plays a big role. When we think about our students with Turkish parents, are these Turkish parents well educated from Istanbul, or are these Turkish parents who have been in school only a few years from a rural background in Anatolia? Just to say, these are completely two different things, and we cannot say because they are Turkish, they are like this. So the intersectional differences is very important to take account of. Religion, when we are speaking about Northern Ireland, disability, sexual orientation, not least personality. So it's very difficult also to come to terms with all these different all these differences. So when we talk about cultural scripts, that is those practices that children learn when they live in their family and which is the norm of their behavior. This is only one of the important aspects when interacting with other students, with teachers who have a different cultural background. And to understand it better, this image, this model shows that you should also think about three other elements. That is the power asymmetry, which you have in not only in the society between those different groups, but also in a situation in the school, like the school leader is from Ireland or Austria and so on, and the parents are from maybe an African country, and it is not only that there is a power asymmetry between those countries in a general global perspective, but also in this situation. Then there are a lot of images of the other, how the other, for example, in Austria, very strong images about how the Turkish father is typically, or the Turkish mother, and this hinders oftentimes an authentic communication. And then we have collective experiences of groups in a society which play a big role in those interactions. So we have to be very careful, of course, when we talk about culture and what can be the reason of difficulties in assessment processes. Well, the teachers react very differently to cultural otherness in the countries, and a good model, I think, to understand what the teachers also said is that there is always a tension between treating the students the same as all others, the students with migration background, and this would be here equality, and taking account of the very particular background of the student, that is taking account of the diversity in the classroom. And when you exaggerate equality, it obviously becomes indifference, and it becomes assimilation pressure, so that you expect and want the student to be the same. We also heard color blindness as an approach which is I think dominant also in North America, at least in some schools, so that teachers say we want to treat everyone the same, and this is also true in several of our schools which where we have been with our case studies. And the other extreme, of course, is that everything is seen as a consequence of the cultural background of the student. So this is also an exaggeration which can have negative consequences for the student when everything is brought back to presumably the cultural background. What we found in asking, interviewing the teachers and the school leaders is that many of them didn't know about cultural responsive assessment. They have never heard the terminology, and we of course got aware of the fact that the discourses within the teaching force, within the public, in the countries are very different. And so in one country you can relate to concepts because it has already been around the concept within the teaching force in a continuing professional education, or maybe with the representatives of the teacher in the political sphere. And in other countries you have to find how you can establish the concept when speaking with the teacher, and so that they really understand what it is all about. So without an established discourse, they lack the terminology, they lack, so to say, the argumentative universe, and even ideas about that matter. So in some countries it's really important to start the discourse, to establish the discourse, and so that teachers can relate to it. As a final point, inclusive systems are more open to cultural responsive assessment. We found that in Ireland and Norway there is much more awareness and application of these practices. And of course you can do it in the assessment procedures, the cultural responsive assessment, or even in the grading, or combine both or none. And I can only say, please come to the workshop after the lunch break. All these practices will be mentioned and discussed, and you can see that there were a lot of different practices mentioned, and I hope that you will attend this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Quick question for Barbara, anyway? Yeah?
Hi.
Hi.
I thank you very much. You brought me back to my childhood, because I was in Germany, in Bavaria, in that kind of grading system. And I have to tell you that it is not easy for a migrant student to develop and be full potentially successful in this kind of system. So I wanted to ask you, thank you very much by the way, I wanted to ask you, because Austria, Germany, etc., these countries are the countries who have, or who are dealing with the migrant students for 38 years now. How would you say, share your experience as a country, from educational point of view, how to handle or how to move to this issue, to develop it and to make everybody equal in the classroom, no matter what background they have? Because Ireland is new, as far as I know, new in this kind of migration happening in the education system. So I think if we can get this kind of information from those experienced countries, that would help the new countries in this education system to tackle and to be successful. I have no idea actually how the Austrian education system is done with the, you know, the Turkish people. And I see that in the last few or 10 years you had this kind of development, but I'm not sure how much it was really successful. If you can explain that to me, I would be very happy. Thank you.
This would take some time, but very short. It is important to understand that in a country where this topic is used on a daily basis for political reasons from the right-wing parties, it's much harder to establish, you know, positive approaches and positive practices that value diversity, as it is compared to a country where you don't have that strong negative discourse. This is one very important thing. Of course, we could talk about many others, but I think it would be a time issue, and maybe we can do at the end, because now there is still a presentation, and I'm here after.
Thank you.
Thank you.